Welcome to the Deep Dive Book Club podcast. I'm Leo.
I'm Joel.
You can reach out to us at deepdivebookclub@gmail.com. On Patreon, we are Deep Dive Book Club. On Instagram, Deep Dive Book Club. YouTube, Deep Dive Book Pod. We're all over the place.
For anyone just tuning in, this podcast is centered on having long format discussions about books that we've read or books that we're in the process of reading. We dive both into fiction and nonfiction. The only thing better than reading a good book is having a great discussion about it, and we would love to include you in our conversation. So if you want to add anything to any of the books we've talked about, please message us at all the places Leo said, and we would love to read your comments and engage with them on air.
Today, we are covering Burnout Society by Byung-Chul Han. This is a small but dense book. A lot of fun. I really enjoyed reading it. This, we figured, would flow well with the topics we've been covering lately. We're going to start with a summary. Before we do that, Joel, any overarching thoughts on this book?
On the book itself, it's rather short but dense rhetoric. Part of it's going to be the translation from German, and part of it's going to be from an academic slant. I'll say that we've definitely referenced this book for any listeners that heard earlier episodes. I'm sure we've talked about it before because it comes up in a good context for kind of like painting a picture of our modern society.
All right, with that, let's kind of summarize what is talked about in this little book. In the Burnout Society, Byung-Chul Han argues that modern Western society has shifted from a disciplinary society ruled by external authority and prohibition to an achievement society driven by internalized pressure to perform. Where people were once controlled by the no of institutions and rules, they are now motivated by the endless yes of self-optimization, productivity, and personal success. We no longer feel oppressed by others. Instead, we voluntarily push ourselves to exhaustion.
And we'll get deeper into it, but that disciplinary society is kind of like we can think of feudal society. You can't do this, you can do that. It's easy if you just have a king telling you what to do. Nowadays, though, hey, you can go to school and study whatever you want and get whatever degree, and then you can work really hard to make all that money.
Exactly.
Burnout is not a private weakness, but a social condition rooted in a culture that demands constant performance. In a world saturated with stimuli and perpetual activity, our capacity for deep focus and contemplation erodes. Attention becomes fragmented and multitasked, leaving little room for reflection or meaningful connection. What appears to be freedom, the ability to achieve anything, turns out to be a subtler form of self-exploitation. Ultimately, the book argues that genuine freedom and human flourishing lies not in endless achievements, but in reclaiming space for reflection, stillness, and depth.
And that is essentially the through line that runs through this book. The way it's laid out is a series of essays, essentially. Each individual chapter is more or less an essay that could be self-contained, even though there's some interreferencing going on.
When we were talking about this book, it's not a direct comparison, but a thought that came up was the movie The Big Lebowski with the character The Dude, who is representing an enjoyable life while not achieving what society would say is high markers. He enjoys bowling, he enjoys hanging out with his friends, and he's perfectly happy and content with the place he's at.
The Dude is definitely not a citizen of an achievement society or a disciplinary society. He's a free man.
Right. In many ways, a hero in that context. And I think I would like to know Han's ideas of the Dude as a character in reference to his ideas of a disciplinary society.
I believe the narrator in that movie is kind of standing in for the figure of God and says, I don't know about you, but I'm grateful that a guy like the Dude exists. I feel that way sometimes when I see someone just enjoying life to the fullest.
Without running in the rat race that many industrial societies have set up. And with that idea of that narrator for The Big Lebowski, or Han and his concepts, going through his life story, truncated aspect, will kind of help reflect the meaning and writings that he has here in the book.
Yeah, let's talk about his life, because in his own right, he's a fascinating person. So he is a professor in his 60s that subverted our idea of achievement and hardworking culture while being considered an impactful pop philosopher. And he doesn't fit neatly into many categories, and I would argue that he doesn't even fit neatly into pop philosopher.
That's fine. I accept your argument. I read many critiques of him that used that phrase, which is why I have it here.
Yeah, other academics don't like the brevity of his work and how that he is kind of accessible to popular philosophy. But he's also not as accessible as as what you would think of the term pop philosopher. He just doesn't fit neatly into either camp.
So Byung-Chul Han studied metallurgy at Korea University before moving to Germany in his early 20s to pursue philosophy, German literature, and Catholic theology, Freiburg and Munich, despite not knowing German or philosophy at the time. Originally drawn to literature, he switched to philosophy because it allowed for a slower, more deliberate study. In 1994, he earned a doctorate degree from the University of Freiburg with a dissertation on Mood and Steinmug, if I'm saying the German correctly, in Martin Heidelberg. And I'll say...
Heidegger.
And I'll say he talks about, in some of his interviews, he was pushed to study metallurgy at the Korea University by his parents because they thought it would allow him to achieve a greater success in life and a greater monetary value.
Han later taught at the University of Basel, Karlsruhe University of Arts and Design, and the Berlin University of the Arts, focusing on modern philosophy, ethics, social theory, phenomenology, aesthetics, religion, and media theory. Han, a devotee of slow living, is a somewhat eccentric guy. He does what he wants because he can, due to his success, and because he sees this approach to existence as a political act. The world has chosen the wrong path, and that's why he goes in the opposite direction.
From a famous interview of him, because he is a little notorious for rejecting interviews, especially interviews about his work in itself. This is something I read from, and I forget the interviewer's name, but quote, this is Byung-Chul Han talking in this interview. Quote, "The human being lives backwards. He goes in the opposite direction. Simone Weil, the French philosopher who wrote Waiting for God, says so. Humans are violent. They destroy the environment. No animal is violent with nature except for man. He disturbs what he owes his life to, and how can you escape this upside-down life? By living backwards." End quote.
As Joel mentioned, Han is known for being a rather solitary man. He lives in a bubble of his own creation, dividing his time between two houses, an apartment in the southwest of Berlin and a house with a garden between a lake and a forest. He has a smartphone, his anathema, but he barely uses it. He almost never picks up when someone calls. He uses it, he says, to correctly classify the plants in his garden. He doesn't like mixing with others too much, which is why he grants so few interviews. Before this past August, the last time he spoke to the magazine El País in person was in 2014. Author of over 30 books, he is best known for works such as The Burnout Society and The Transparent Society, where he critiques neoliberalism, digital culture, and what he calls a society of tiredness and a society of transparency. His recent work argues that neoliberal demands for constant visibility create a coercive culture of self-exposure that erodes shame, secrecy, and trust. In quiet resistance to digital capitalism, Han avoids smartphones, tourism, digital music, and cultivates a private secret garden described in his book, In Praise of the Earth.
I like that he describes his secret garden so that it's no longer secret. But not in a digital format.
No. As much as he can, he resists the digital format. Highly interesting guy. I highly recommend reading about him and finding a little bit of public information there is about him, just to have the enjoyment of knowing that there's a guy out there like that.
He definitely lives differently, and it's enjoyable that other people have different styles of living for us to question what we could do, what we should do, and what other avenues of life there are available for us. I think about many of those types of people, especially the Hare Krishna individuals I've met before that live a completely different lifestyle than the modern society. And in some ways, it's nice to know that these people exist. And when I was at a Soto Zen temple and I was at a sesshin or a retreat for 3 days meditating, I thought about some of the people that go into the monkhood to constantly meditate and upkeep temples and provide those spaces and their value. And in many ways, even never seeing some of the temples or some of the monks, they provide almost like a stand-in in society to provide for that society. And one of the things I think about is in Thailand, there were people, specifically Theravada monks, that would cultivate a temple, allow for meditation, and they would be there in a society. And people would give them food and appreciate their existence, I think because they were doing spiritual work, even if the spiritual work wasn't observed. And they provided that type of structure. So the farmer is farming away, knowing that a monk is doing all of the spiritual work for him, if that makes sense.
A spiritual division of labor. It makes sense.
I feel like everything we've done is an overview and summary in a way because his work is so short. And with that, if that's the case, before we get into the deep dissection, we'll take a quick break.
All right, see you guys in a minute. Joel, the first thing I wanted to talk about is the immunological images that Han gives us to discuss and think about in this opening essay that he has of the book. The opening essay is titled Neuronal Power. First thing, before we jump into it, is I want to discuss the term positivity. Throughout the book, he uses the term positivity, and from my understanding, because I'm not formally trained in philosophy, but what he means here is that it's not happiness or optimism. He means something a little bit more technical. By positivity, he means excess, affirmation, and a focus on what is possible. And he contrasts this to the term negativity, which he describes as a focus more on limits and boundaries. So simply put, negativity says you must. Positivity says you can. And then as we'll see, he argues that in a burnout society, that word can becomes the word ought. Just because you can do something slowly morphs into you ought to do something. Because you can work overtime and you can answer your emails at 9 p.m., slowly shifts to you ought to do that.
I mean, you could say you can avoid going to work at a firm that's going to overwork you. You can avoid working overtime, yet that's not the Achievement Society mantra.
Exactly. Any thoughts about those terms and how he uses them before we jump into the immunological thinking?
For the listeners' benefit, I think one thing we need to do before we dive deeper into it is just talk about the terms itself. And I know immunological, some people might not understand what Han means here. Immunological is just immunology, not necessarily talking about immunology from a biomedical standpoint. He sometimes talks about it in a societal standpoint, as in the immune system of the society, and he'll get into psychoanalytical terminology to mean immunological as he discusses positivity, negativity, ADHD, depression, and other things of that nature. And in addition, his use of pathology here is not the traditional use of pathology. Pathology just meaning the study of diseases. Again, he talks about it with a skew to a sociological perspective of that word, as well as a psychoanalytical concept for depression and ADHD.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Only thing I would add in is he doesn't use he doesn't venture into the psychoanalytic realm. It's just psychological. Psychoanalytic specifically refers to Freudian.
He pulls some of that into it when he talks about the reason for or the pathology for depression and all of these things.
I don't remember that.
Okay.
But we'll jump into it. We have a whole section for us to talk about depression. But you are absolutely right.
I didn't want them to get confused on those terms because they don't mean exactly their medical meaning.
You're absolutely right. He's using them in a metaphorical sense, specifically for the societal level and for the individual level. But yes, that is a good forewarning, just like the forewarning on those terms, because, as we were discussing this book with friends, that became a point of confusion for some people who weren't versed in the technicalities. And the only reason we know it is just because we did research and Googling. All right, with that, let's start with a quote from this first essay, Neuronal Power. Quote, "From a pathological standpoint, the incipient 21st century is determined neither by bacteria nor by viruses, but by neurons. Neurological illnesses such as depression, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, borderline personality disorder, and burnout syndrome mark the landscape of pathology at the beginning of the 21st century. They are not infections, but infarctions. They do not follow from the negativity of what is immunologically foreign, but from an excess of positivity. Therefore, they elude all technologies and techniques that seek to combat what is alien." End quote.
Great. Okay. And the only other term, the clarity that I want to make sure listeners have, because especially if you haven't read this book, infarction, the most likely place you've encountered that is myocardial infarction, which is like a heart attack. Infarction means cell death or tissue death, typically. And so that cardio infarction means your heart tissue is dying. And in this case, I just want to again point out, there's not an explanation, but he's using this metaphorical.
Exactly. Yeah, he's very steeped in the metaphor here that he's bringing to bear. So the warning that this is not as literal as it appears.
Right, and don't feel bad because he doesn't explain it in his book either. You just got to pick it up.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly. So essentially the way I read this is that the author is asking us to do a thought experiment of looking at the current and previous major errors in modern history through two broad ways of viewing the world. To sum it up, it'd be the immunological perspective and the neuronal perspective, with the immunological perspective showing a clear us versus them mentality where threats, like infections in the metaphor, are external and can be fought directly. The neuronal perspective, from my understanding of this essay and the quote we just went over, is that it is a state of overwhelm or exhaustion caused by an excess of positivity. There's that word again. An excess of positivity where the challenges, like burnout or depression, stem from overstimulation or depletion, not a single tangible enemy. There's not one thing to delineate us versus them.
Right. And I think he's taking us on this thought experiment to think of society as a human body or a holistic system, which is not alien to us or other thought experiments that philosophers have utilized, because in a way we can look at the small and large together and being a similar trajectory. Taking before industrial era, you have set fiefdoms, kingdoms, and so forth that they typically have to deal with external threats, and that's just like an infection or a virus where you have white blood cells or military or otherwise violent capabilities of ejecting or rejecting those infections.
Right, literally fighting off foreign invasion.
Correct, and that's the easiest metaphorical attachment we can have here. As opposed to now he gets into the modern century, and his argument here, to the best of my knowledge, I mean, I'd love to be corrected here, is that we now no longer have this external threat that we can easily identify and fight against, but rather we have an internal threat that is more insidious than, say, a cancer-style threat, where it's the same system that we have a hard time recognizing and defending against. And this is where we get to that that neural perspective, where as he talks about it's a pathology or disease by the neurons. And in this case, he talks about the introduction of depression, ADHD, and borderline personality, as well as burnout.
And he straddles the metaphorical and literal here, because he's saying that in part what he's saying here, along with this interesting use of the metaphor, is that those psychological disorders, depression, ADHD, borderline personality, and burnout, are symptoms in part due to the type of society we've created now. That lack of us versus them has transformed into, now it's, as he'll get into, us versus ourselves. And like you pointed out with cancer, one of the main issues with cancer is just the body's inability to differentiate between what's foreign and bad for us and what's actually us.
And in that case, going out on a limb, perhaps that's us connecting what is internally taught to us so much that it becomes dogmatic without question, and what is truly innate. And by that I mean, if you're taught from a young age by books and movies and Disney Channel that you need to achieve all of your dreams and it's all hard work, right? We see that trope through so many movies, the training mantras and whatnot. You have to work really hard in order to achieve. Although there might be some truth behind that, that's setting up a society of what Han would call achievement subjects, right? You need to have internal drive in order to achieve everything you want. You need to push yourself further and further. And in that case, we don't have an external threat presented. We have rather an internal concept derived in us.
And the writing here is interesting, and it's the same throughout the book, where he pushes it to be provocative. There's a provocation here, talking about these mental illnesses. He says, they are not infections, but infarctions. They do not follow from the negativity of what is immunologically foreign, but from an excess of positivity. Here's the provocation, where he takes it a step further. He says, therefore, they elude all technologies and techniques that seek to combat what is alien. So he pushes it one step further. And that's something I noticed throughout all the writing, which I enjoyed. But then when he takes that leap into an absolute claim like that, that's where there's grappling to be had.
We can get into this as we close the book and we kind of give our overall thoughts and opinions, but I have a similar feeling in that he uses hey, let me take you into this fantasy world and set up everything and then say this is right. Well, yeah.
Right.
You took me into your world. You took away any postulates that could be a counter argument. And now you say, can't you agree with this? And that, to me, is a little bit of developing that straw man system.
And one of the things that, naturally jumps out when encountering this essay for the first time, just thinking about it in isolation from the other ideas that are in the book, is, okay, well, entertaining the metaphor for the moment, for the sake of the argument in the essay, what events or developments do I think have caused the paradigm shift from immunological to neuronal? Just entertaining the metaphor to start with. What do you think about that? What paradigm shifts come to mind when we've made this shift, as we've slowly went from a immunological societal perspective to neuronal?
There's perhaps some validity there that we can see, especially in our Western society, developing this achievement-based subjugation, self-exploitation, as Han would say. Although I don't think it's as impactful as perhaps his essays derive it to be, because I believe there's still an innate drive for humans to acquire resources. And we see that in pre-industrial revolution humans as well. There is a constant drive towards acquiring more resources. Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great, is a great example of pre-industrial, a nonstop ambition to acquire more and more. And in many ways, you could look at him as a self-exploitation or achievement-based structure. So I think there's still an innate piece that Han disregards in his metaphors?
I think the disregard, this is the way that I read the essay. I don't mind the disregard because I think it's all part of the same thought experiment. And I agree with you, there is just a clear, hey, we are shoving everything on the table off to the side, and I'm just pulling out these pieces and these metaphors, and this is what we're looking at right now, concisely under the spotlight. So I don't mind the disregard of inconvenient truths and patterns that counter the metaphor, as long as I keep in mind that this is a thought experiment, this is a metaphor. For me, the going from like the 1800s, where society's rules and the heyday of the Industrial Revolution really gave things a black and white set of rules for people to follow, a black and white set of protocols, both in society and what we think of as work. And that shifted to, in the Western world, in a lot of places, intellectual work, white collar work, where now there's not someone standing at the factory door making sure you get in there on time, but there is an overwhelming pressure to perform that's largely driven internally. And I can understand how, with the argument he's making, that it's more likely that symptoms of depression and burnout would be more prevalent now in the modern era than in previous eras. So I think that's where our opinions are a little different on the thought experiment in general, which is fun to look at the differences there. And that's kind of what we've seen when we've discussed this with other people, is that there's a variety of reflections on the way the metaphor in general gets digested.
Yeah, and I don't mind a metaphor or allegory where you play with certain pieces, but I do mind that as a modern writer, he doesn't at the end say, all right, we've played with this thought experiment, we've taken it and extrapolated what we can, and now let's plug that back in to see how useful it is. But to me, I suppose that's more of an engineering type philosopher rather than his type of philosophy.
Right. The essay is there, and there's some through lines throughout the whole work, of course, but he doesn't plug it in. He doesn't go for a unified theory. He doesn't go for this massive tome that answers all possible questions and rebuttals and fits it into, a magnum opus spanning 1,000 pages that addresses every single situation. He's got his thought experiment here, and it's just strung together with some other interesting essays, and there are through lines. Right, he's not interested in taking the time to have an ongoing discourse about it.
I mean, he doesn't plug it into any useful thing, is my point. He's not an engineering philosopher. He doesn't make it work.
Right, and I'm okay with that.
That's fine.
I'm okay with that.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I like a nice fantasy world where we just play. That's okay. And there's nothing wrong with asking hypotheticals and exploring that further, because those are fun. That's part of being humans and thinking and having imagination. I'm okay with that too.
So that's interesting that you say that. So for you, does it take away from the argument, or does it bother you that he does not connect it back into, reality a little bit more?
It diminishes its value in an academic and realistic setting for me, but that doesn't diminish the value of the writing or thought experiment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to understand, is your opinion of its context, which is that's fascinating, because for me, I would
put him more towards Terry Pratchett rather than more towards James Clear.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I guess for me, it doesn't bother me. I like it.
And that's okay?
Yeah. I'm perfectly okay with an orphan essay that doesn't walk back into the living room of reality. All right. Keeping with that through line of thinking physiologically and immunologically as metaphors, Han later contrasts his argument with another thinker named Baudrillard. Han essentially says that thinking of our modern issues in an immunological way is outdated and is not the best tool to employ in our conceptual toolkit. Baudrillard, on the other hand, from what Han quotes, essentially argues that our current societal challenges and issues are viral and therefore still immunological. And this is Hahn quoting Baudrillard. Quote, "The violence of networks and the virtual is viral. It is the violence of benign extermination operating at the genetic and communicational level. A violence of consensus. A viral violence in the sense that it does not operate head on, but by contiguity, contagion, and chain reaction. Its aim being the loss of all our immunities. And also in the sense that, contrary to the historical violence of negation, this virus operates hyperpositively, like cancerous cells, through endless proliferation, excrescence, and metastases. Between virtuality and virality, there is a kind of complicity." End quote. That is some fun reading right there. I like that. So Hahn's argument here in general, from what I remember this essay, is that the immunological perspective that Baudrillard is painting here is outdated. Hahn is arguing more for the neuronal. He's simply put, my opinion is that what Hahn is saying is using the us versus them lens that immunological thinking presents is not as useful in the modern era as what he was talking about, the neuronal way of looking at issues.
Sure. I think here Baudrillard is arguing more that it's similar to cancer cells, right? He talks about that in terms of the endless proliferation, in terms of it taking over and being like a virus, but still being internally driven or internally created like a cancer cell, right? It's not an external virus. It's an internal cancer that's produced.
So which to you do you like a little bit more or makes a little bit more sense to you? Baudrillard's kind of virality argument or Hahn's neuronal argument?
When we were reading the book, I had a hard time setting it up in a parallel, comparing it to, because Hahn has more of an argument for the excess of positivity and having a societal commentary on our infection via neurological disorder in order to achieve success in our modern society. But I feel like Baudrillard does a better job of showing the violence inherent in the system, in terms of how it breaks down us as individuals connecting through a more simple way, and how that complicity in between the virtual world kind of erodes our ability to just be happy and content.
The thing that really jumped out to me in this review of the essay is that phrase, the violence of consensus, which absolutely makes sense and seems to be right in line with what Hahn is talking about. Hahn's issue is more so with the immunological perspective. I remember first going through this being persuaded by Hahn's overall argument that the immunological way of thinking is not very fitting for the current era. Now, reviewing this, having read the whole book and digested it a little bit more, now reviewing this, like you, I like Baudrillard's argument just as much as what Hahn is saying here. I understand Hahn's point that, hey, there might be a better way of looking at the modern issues we have psychologically and sociologically, socially, but not necessarily that there's anything wrong with Baudrillard's argument.
Right. I didn't think it was an either or. The way that Hahn sets it up is that it is shifting, right? Kind of an academic argument to shift the overall concept from that immunological to the neurological. However, I don't think that's a transposition that is necessary or particularly possible, but rather these are two sets of tools in the toolkit in order to try to grasp society's issues or the things in society and make sense of it on a more simple scale in order to potentially achieve something to address it. So I think Baudrillard's concepts are also valid and useful, but in a slight different perspective. Because each of these, at the end of the day, is not a sociologist's approach to handling these issues. Both of these are philosophers' lenses to interpret society's issues, in my opinion.
Agreed. And I like having both of these lenses at hand. They're fun ways to look at the issues and give different perspectives on it. I like it. Any other thoughts here on these two ways of thinking, these two paradigms, the metaphor in general?
No, I think they're both good.
All right, let's take a quick break, and then we will jump into some more ideas. Next up, I wanted to talk about Hot War and Cold War. This is a quote from Han. "The violence of positivity does not presume or require hostility. It unfolds specifically in a permissive and pacified society. Consequently, it proves more invisible than viral violence." End quote. The example, and this is speaking only from the American perspective, the example that comes to mind is that the 20th century had Pearl Harbor. This century does not, except for 9/11, which it has been argued was the real end of the 90s and the 1900s in general. It has been argued that large-scale war is too risky in the modern era and that we will mostly see intense Cold Wars and cyber warfare, which both have a superficial, plausible deniability. What do you think, Joel? Do you agree that at least in the West, the current era is marked by a general lack of distinct acts of violence on a large scale, and that now change and force are happening more through passivity and coercion? I know my opinion based off of recent events.
My thought when I first read this, and I forget if we talked about this in the in-person book club, was the Golden Arches theory that Friedman had, which is incorrect, but very succinctly, Friedman argued that large-scale warfare won't be seen again because of everything we just talked about. And part of that is the economic interwoven connectivity of our globalized economy now. And his Golden Arches theory was that once countries have McDonald's, that's the Golden Arches, that they wouldn't have open or hot war again because of that interwoven economic connection. However, that's not true because Russia has invaded multiple places that has McDonald's. They both have McDonald's and all of these things. So that's that theory in itself is disproven, but I do think it harkens to perhaps a more fundamental truth that we're seeing play out in our current century, which is large superpowers don't go to war with each other in an open hot war directly because of the economic disparity that would cause. We just can't afford to disrupt supply lines in that manner without starving your society, creating unrest, and then potentially economic governmental instability.
Right. I agree with the general thrust here, even though there's regrettably in the middle 2020s where we're recording this.
I thought we're not going to date ourselves.
Well, we have to in this instance because there's an unfortunate amount of hot conflicts going on throughout the world as we record. In general, I agree, though, that what has kind of shifted is that the money and resources and value to be made off of economic pursuits and economic exploitation of the capital market, of the global market, is more lucrative and advantageous than what can be gained by a traditional war. In the 1800s, it made sense for Napoleon to go on the march. Now, if we had a modern Napoleon, he would be doing it mostly through economic gains. It just makes more sense with how interconnected we are. So, like you, I agree with the thrust of the idea. Just the reality of the hot conflicts is an issue.
We often discuss economics, and I think we can overemphasize sometimes that, people wouldn't do anything if they don't make money, or these companies wouldn't just help people, they want money. Governments or America wouldn't invade these places unless it made money. I understand this perspective of, greed drives all, but I would like to add a little bit of a disagreement in that, and I'll pull in fake meat for my example here. And it's not just me. I've listened to a lot of economists and read research articles on this, in that, sure, we look at this greed perspective of how can a company or a country or an individual make money, and that's going to drive their actions. That's not necessarily only a greed perspective, but also a resource perspective. Because if we take away kind of this shell of what money is, at the end of the day, the drive towards coin or currency was to provide a free flow of commerce, and those coins or currencies inscribed a sort of value. And that value is related to resource. And so we have super complex resources in our modern society. So $1 or $1 million is not necessarily just money. It's also a reflection of value. So a lot of the arguments against fake meat is that if the fake meat costs $10 a pound, but real meat costs $5 a pound, it's actually more deleterious. The fake meat is more deleterious to the environment because it costs more resources in order to produce that. In many similar ways, we talk about in engineering, if you build a hospital and you make it withstand a category 5 hurricane instead of building it to a category 4 hurricane, why wouldn't you do that to save more lives for that, once every 100 years storm? Well, there is moral and ethical requirements that they actually lower that so that the rest of that money can be used to build other things that will save more lives. So I want to pull that back to say, I agree with you, and I don't think we're going to see as many hot wars because of that economic value. And Napoleon wouldn't do that nowadays because they had a burn rate that they had to feed their armies not only with money but also with resources. Nowadays we have to do the exact same thing, and we're looking at not just quote-unquote money, but that meaning and value in a resource.
Agreed. Very well put. The other thing that this section reminds me of is the time period that he wrote it in, which I believe is around the year 2015. And it's interesting to see what has lasted the test of time. It's been a decade plus now versus kind of what's aged a little bit. And I think we've already kind of pointed that out, the difference between the nature of current hot conflicts and cold conflicts.
We see this, but warfare has changed, and I think it's going to continue to change because now we're seeing over in the European theater lots of drone and technological advances that change the use of the individual. And back when I worked on some more technology specifically, we often looked at how many support units it takes to have one war fighter and how much money it takes to have one war fighter. And if we look at the ancient societies, they typically had that value in terms of armor. So armor would be passed down generationally, and they would have to have one male from each family come and join a militia. And so you have one family being that quote-unquote support unit, or the amount of food produced for it, as compared to today, and even World War II, and I'd love to look this up again and give more direct comparisons, but it's like an insane amount of support units that we have now to support one soldier in the field.
And it's the same with machines. Helicopters and jets, have whole crews dedicated to supporting them, maintaining them, and
for one unit.
Right. Good point. The only thing that I would point out here, and this is a bit of a digression, maybe not, is cyber warfare is not on the ground, person-to-person violence, but it is extreme when you look at its effects and the damage that can be done and the degree of penetration that can be done. And it kind of plays to Han's previous metaphorical image that because it is not as clearly us versus them or an enemy hostility that's seen physically, it's kind of more nebulous. It's harder to get your mind around the idea that this is violence in its own way. It's digital violence. It's a war taking place in, a parallel layer of our world. And just because it's not physically person against person, it is harder to have that immunological response to it. We're slower, both as individuals and a society, to respond to these immunological threats that aren't as overt, I thought that was just an interesting thing to note about his metaphor and how it applies to the current situation.
In some ways, you could look at it as more insidious.
Yeah, the damage that can be done with cyber warfare and that is being done with cyber warfare is immense and catastrophic, but it's not a bomb being dropped. Therefore, it's harder to identify it as hostility directly. All right, let's move on to what I think is maybe the main idea that crowns this little book, the idea of the Achievement Society. So let's talk about his essay, Beyond Disciplinary Society. Byung-Chul contrasts two types of societies. The past, which he calls the Disciplinary Society, was defined by institutions like hospitals, prisons, barracks, and factories, places that enforced obedience through strict rules and external control. Today, he argues, we live in an achievement society shaped by fitness studios, office towers, banks, airports, shopping malls, and genetic laboratories. Quote, 21st century society is no longer a disciplinary society, but rather an achievement society. Prohibitions, commandments, and the law are replaced by projects, initiatives, and motivation. Disciplinary society is still governed by no. Its negativity produces madmen and criminals. In contrast, achievement society creates depressives and losers. End quote. In the disciplinary society, people were obedience subjects, controlled by external forces like laws and prohibitions. In the achievement society, we've become achievement subjects, driven by internal pressure to produce, optimize, and succeed. Hans suggests this shift stems from our desire to be ever more efficient. This idea is kind of echoed in what's called the checklist life that we read about in the Comfort Crisis, which we will talk about in a future episode. But it's the same thing where societal expectations push us to achieve, but we internalize and enforce these demands on ourselves. We don't have someone standing over us. So Joel, tell me your opinion on Hans' idea that we've moved from being obedient subjects to achievement subjects. Does this framework resonate with you?
I think this is a summarized metaphor of how we can view our society as well as other societies. Perhaps we can apply this in a historical context, although like any lens, it is cracked and not perfect. But it is nice to have it present to look at and use in the toolkit. I do think it can apply at times, but in plenty of other times we need to put it away because it's not the right tool for the right time. In regards to obedient subjects, that makes sense. He talks about the use of external laws, prohibitions, and things of that nature. Although when he says it produces madmen, one of his arguments for us being an achievement society as opposed to an obedient society, he also in a multitude of terms says that we become madmen. But he uses that in he uses more neurological terms. So in that regard, I think he's incorrect in his supposition that he provides for himself here. Now, depression was still prevalent before our most modern industrialization, and we had many issues back then that society had to deal with, perhaps in a more violent way, in ways that we would say are more barbarian, but in some ways might be the exact same thing that we have now, just like we were talking about earlier, a more subtle form of it.
Negativity of disciplinary society produces madmen and criminals. And then he goes on to say the achievement society creates depressives and losers. I agree with you that the lens has its limitations. For me, this is one of the ideas in the book that has stuck with me the most. I think it is really useful to look at the things that drive us and the things that give us worry and keep us up at night in the modern world that aren't directly related to survival. It's very interesting to note that, and I think he taps a very applicable vein here. I think he's found something, and I think that it's worth taking a look at. I really like this idea, and even though the lens has its limitations, which is an important thing to think about, it's not all-encompassing. None of his things are all-encompassing, and again, I'm fine with it just being one curiosity on the table to look at. But it is useful to look at, okay, why do I feel the need to answer my email at 9 p.m.? Why do I feel the need to, push myself a little bit harder today when I don't have someone standing over me to do X, Y, and Z? Just because I don't have a deadline, why am I giving myself an artificial deadline? What are these motivations? And this is one useful, if not completely all-encompassing and explanatory, one useful way of looking at it and to see maybe the underlying currents and pressures from a societal perspective that are pushing me in those directions. I like it.
Bringing back the Book of the Five Rings, or the Scrolls of the Five Rings, Musashi also in one of his through lines, I forget which book, but he says, do nothing of no use, or constantly be achieving things, right? And that was back in the 1600s, clearly before our industrial society.
I'm going to disagree there for a second. I agree with the sentiment of don't do anything of no value, but it's not the same thing as constantly be achieving.
All right, I'll disagree with your disagreement, because I think the point of that in Musashi's writings was to say you should constantly be achieving a higher level of swordsmanship, or you should constantly be training. Everything is driving towards that, and there is no end goal. And in that case, I would argue, if we take Han's lens and kind of shine it towards Musashi, we're seeing Musashi falling into the same trap of being an achievement subject, right? He talks about, I trained when I was a kid. I constantly trained. I am writing this now to transmit the knowledge I have.
I see that. I see how you're applying that. Keep going. Makes sense.
And we can look at other writers that we have. Marcus Aurelius. Benjamin Franklin had a very similar thing in his diaries when he was working as a diplomat in France. What you could argue is right there in that time frame in the 1700s of our modern Western ideologies coming to bear, being achievement subjects. But he said a very similar thing of never waste any time. And we see all of these, although I agree with Han in that it's a useful lens, and we are driving our society towards achievement subjects, I believe that he is missing...
Taking the metaphor too far?
He's missing some of the innate portions of humanity that we can see echoed through time.
That's very interesting to think about. I'm glad you brought up Musashi. That's very interesting to think about what is driving Musashi versus what is driving Benjamin Franklin. That is interesting to think about.
But they both had very similar quotes in and of itself, and both from different perspectives. Han's arguments are often from the perspective of industrial Western society. Musashi is exactly the opposite of that.
If I think about the difference between the internal narration for Benjamin Franklin and for Musashi about what's pushing them, the sense that I get from Musashi is a bit more like an artist being obsessed with pursuing his art. I don't get that same thing with Franklin. I have to think about that a little bit more.
And if anyone listening has thoughts, I'd love to hear it too, because this is just my current hypothesis.
Absolutely. I would love to get some listener feedback on this one.
Now, could you argue that that was present or not? And I think that would be more difficult to ascertain because of the lack of evidence we have for individuals, say, during Musashi's time or during Marcus Aurelius's time.
Well,
right?
One thing we do have evidence for in relation to Han's argument is the extremely rules-driven and hierarchy-driven nature of the majority of society that made up the world around Musashi. We do have evidence for that. The samurai class was very distinctive and everyone was very conscious of class differences. But what we don't have is a clear idea, or what at least I don't have, is a clear idea of what cultural drivers were pushing people to think in a very driven, ambitious way, at least in the pursuit of art, that Musashi was doing.
But we don't have the individual sociology lens about what the common person was doing and what was their internal motivations. Nowadays, we can just use our digital footprint and probably apply algorithms to get an understanding of society's ideas because we have such a high literacy rate, we have such a high written rate for individuals. And I mean the common people as in the majority of society that makes that up. And I agree that if we use today's evidence, we can see more of what Han argues, which is that achievement society, that Instagram reel of showing that you're on a cruise or that you have the best this or you are participating in tourism and that your life is great. And we have many other books, not just Han's, that discusses more directly the influences of the depression caused by Facebook or this fake social media influence.
Yeah, I want to jump into the social media conversation more here. But before we jump into that, what you're talking about, let's throw in the concept of efficiency. And I think what I'm reading here from Han is that a major reason we have made this shift from obedience to achievement is our desire for efficiency. He argues that in a way it is more efficient to be internally driven rather than have someone standing over your shoulder. Now, our concept of efficiency, and I'm still thinking about Musashi here, the difference between what, if anything, Benjamin Franklin thought about efficiency as a concept versus Musashi thought about as a concept, I think is an interesting thought experiment. Now, Joel, the through line that Han's painting for what we were doing previously to what we're doing now, that desire for increasing efficiency, I can understand that argument where I don't know that one's a cause and one's an effect, which direction it goes, but I do see the correlation there between, hey, we want to be more efficient to white collar workers driving themselves to work crazy hours and achieve.
I can see that, but I also think efficiency is innate in human beings. That's the whole development of tools for modern man. If we were not driven by efficiency, and in this case I'm talking about efficiency to acquire resources or food, or acquire security or longevity, meaning we can live longer and reproduce more, we wouldn't have modern human. Pre-modern human, we had a drive towards efficiency. That is the development of tools. So I would say Han, again, is wrong in that he does not understand society's lens historically as compared to now. But I do like his thought experiment, and I do think it's useful. And I agree that if we take a step back and we look at a architect of society, they would see it more efficient to make it internally, individually driven rather than externally driven. But there is no modern architect. There is no overarching person, say like a video game person playing a game where they control each monarch to monarch, right? We don't have a omnipresent architect in society.
Unless we're in the Matrix, which if we are, we don't know about it. The architect's behind the curtain.
That's possible.
Back to your discussion of efficiency there with tool making. What comes to mind there is that I think efficiency may have been a byproduct of a drive for survival, whereas now I think what happens because survival is not so imminent in our faces, we mistake the original purpose of efficiency, and efficiency becomes a goal in and of itself, a virtue in and of itself, rather than a necessity out of survival. What do you think?
We can see that in our society I see it in a humorous way from my friends in Asia and my friends in the Middle East that talk about family that says, oh, well, this cousin, by the time they were 8, they did this and that, or they achieved this. And there's a lot of humorous videos on YouTube and all the social medias about how these families compare the children to say which one's more efficient or which one's achieving more. One of my favorite was Banu, a guy I met in a bar in India. I don't know where he's quoting this, but I'm sure it's somewhere. He was saying, in India we have this saying that from the moment you're born, you're in competition, right? And it makes perfect sense, makes complete sense, and it is very true for India, but also true for other places. Even little kids have grades, right? How do you give a kid a grade in first grade to be like, this kid had an A, this kid had a B for their class? And you're constantly doing this competition style of you need to achieve more.
That's how you internalize the achievement.
So I can, again, see the value of that, but I think that we, in using Han's perspective, are foregoing a lot of critical facts and points about humanity to pull into here to say it's not just culture, because we see many different cultures across history apply the same culture that we have now.
So your point is that it's a useful lens, but it's missing a lot of innate drives for achievement and efficiency.
That would be my hypothesis.
So let's shift a little bit here to social media. We've kind of circled around a little bit, and I think it's a fun topic to throw in here. So, reading this stuff and reviewing the material, something that jumped out to me is that with the effect social media has on the average person in our society, at least, is almost like a pressure. There's like this constant pressure to cater to and cultivate your digital presence, your digital avatar, and then there's no off button for that. It's not like social media takes a break. It's not like we turn the internet off at 9 p.m. and turn it back on at 9 a.m. That would be interesting. I don't know how that will work out, but it's not
poorly.
Poorly, very poorly. But it's like a 24/7 pressure to be yourself, but being yourself in a way that's like a parody of yourself. And you almost become enslaved to this digital image to the degree that you're participating on social media and putting yourself out there. Counter argument would be, well, social media is empowering. Social media allows me to express myself and meet people around the world and, express myself in a way that I can't in the physical world.
I don't want any VTubers to get mad at me, but I think VTubing is the far extent of what you're talking about. And VTubing, for anyone that doesn't know, is you create a fake avatar and a person role plays, cosplays as that avatar, and you can interact with that fake avatar. So creating a personification that's not even this person at all.
I would argue that that's just the explicit version of what we're all doing online. If you are interacting with other people online, that's what you're doing.
Yes, but that is the far point. This is like, if we look at all these things, there's everything from someone, quote unquote, being truly authentic, and I'm sure there's plenty of people that are pretty close to authentic, and then we have the far side of that, which is completely inauthentic, and we have plenty of those people as well, and everything in between is as a spectrum.
See, that's interesting that you say that, because the authenticity that you would have online, you can't have an authentic statement or presence without also the effort that goes into putting that statement, that video, that post out there. Like the two are inseparably intertwined. Like if you're going to take a selfie of you having a good time with your friends, you can't separate that image of you having a good time with your friends from the conscious act of self-promotion and self-propagation digitally.
Well, in the same way, I wear clothes when I go outside, regardless of whether it's on social media or not. I'm abiding by society's rules and how people perceive me. The shirt I wear outside is also a representation of myself, rather than me lying about who I truly am, because maybe I'd rather wear tattered clothes. But instead, I wear a nicer clothes in order to be perceived differently. So I think your argument is mute in that we are constantly putting on masks of ourselves in person and online. So in the way that you're saying taking that selfie you can't separate from, I'd say you can't separate it from the clothes that you chose to wear. It's the same argument.
I don't think so. Because wearing clothes is like part of just getting along with society. You're not required to participate in the digital society, though.
You're not required. You're also not required to participate in our society, really. Nowadays, with DoorDash and everything else, you could be as much of a hermit as you want.
You could live in your boxers 24/7. You do not have to unplug from the Matrix because, like you said, you can have your food delivered. You can have everything delivered.
So I think there's a spectrum of authenticity, both in-person interactions and digital interactions.
I just think, I agree that you can be authentic online, but I don't know that, I think it's a lot harder to be authentic.
Sure, it is harder. Communication's harder because so much of our perspective, so much of our interpretation of external stimuli requires human-to-human interaction. Body language, eye movement, eye connection, all of these things add to the subtle power of communication. I agree with you. So it's more difficult. But nonetheless, a perspective, a spectrum in person and digitally.
Another thought I had here related to social media and achievement society and the internal pressures that Han is talking about is that in a way, we end up imitating our own digital avatars. I mentioned briefly before, but I think that's something, especially the more intense versions like VTubing and being an influencer or being someone that participates quite a bit on social media, you end up paying a lot more calories and attention to that image, and that image in a way starts to take a life of its own, and then there's a discourse between you and that image where you can see almost the thought process happening to, like, let's say an influencer saying, okay, what would my image do? Not necessarily what would I do, but then the question becomes, what would my image do?
Absolutely. And in that way, sometimes you are what you pretend to be. And great examples of this can be found through the music industry of performers, right?
Right.
So what is the stage personification? And you don't break that. Wrestling, I think, is also a great example of this, right? I think in the wrestling world, they call it kayfabe. You don't break kayfabe, which is just saying you don't break character. Like when you're out in public, you act like, the Judge or the Dreaded Hammer, whatever wrestler there is. And I'm not disparaging wrestling. I think it's a great art form. But they have roles that they fulfill. And in similar ways, we can see that, like you're talking about influencers. There is a personification. What would that image do? But it's the same in the music industry, the wrestling industry, all these industries, even politics, right? At some level, some politicians are, well, what would that image do that my voters voted for? Not who I am, but what they see.
Right. Yeah. What would my image do? What would my avatar do?
Mm-hmm.
Which is the opposite of the relationship that I feel like one should have with an avatar. But then again, that's just part of what happens. And I think this feeds back into what Han is talking about, where we have these interesting internal rather than external drivers pushing us.
I think one of the things that add to Han's argument in an agreement is society often bolsters unique cases or lottery cases, I would say, to show success. And in that, I mean successful athletes or successful music stars or people that got rich via some nuanced way. And I think society uses that as a, look what you can achieve, you got to keep working hard. Look at these people we're celebrating, they got money, and look at their big houses. You should imitate these things and continue to be achievement subjects.
Agreed. Any other thoughts you have here on this particular line of thinking?
I think we've beaten this like a nice molded piece of clay.
The only other thing I would add here is that I appreciate your point of where the lens breaks down. I'm a little leery of focusing too much on where it breaks down, because to me, that's similar to missing the point of, let's say, a poem where the poet says something to the effect of moonlight is green or sunlight is blue. And to get hung up on how that doesn't necessarily plug into reality is to miss the point of the poem. And I think that's part of we'll talk about this more when we look at the reviews and the critiques of the work from other people. But I think that's part of the disconnect there with his work, is that it's mistaking, the actual meaning and purpose of the work for smaller technicalities. The technicalities are not his focus. That's the only thing I would add.
I would agree with you if this was poetry or a piece of art, but it's not. These are academic essays.
Yeah, they're straddling an interesting place. They're straddling an interesting place, but this is not an academic work. This is a book published for the general population. With
his academic essays.
Right. But
I mean,
still,
these he published these for academics
but
prior
still,
to putting it into the book.
This is for general consumption. He's not specifically playing the academic game. He's just writing what he wants to write.
He is writing what he wants to
write.
Just
because he's submitting a poem to a math arena doesn't take away from the fact that he is still writing poetry.
Sure, yeah. I would agree with you if his work was fiction.
But it's neither fiction nor nonfiction. He is throwing out a metaphor there in a poetic way for us to think about and grapple with. He's not worried about the technicalities, and the technicalities are irrelevant to his overall point.
And we're definitely grappling and interacting with it. So I would say he was successful in his desires.
Who knows what his motivations were for writing, because he's not, part of the issue is he's not really that interested in discourse.
Now that we've gone deep into some diving far away from this, let's return back to Han's work and dissect more of maybe some of his lenses that we can use.
Right. Next up, let's talk about depression. In the essay Beyond Disciplinary Society, Byung-Chul Han explores why depression is so prevalent in our modern world. He draws on a powerful quote from Elaine Ehrenberg to set the stage. Quote, "Depression began its ascent when the disciplinary model for behaviors, the rules of authority and observance of taboos that gave social classes, as well as both sexes, a specific destiny, broke against norms that invited us to undertake personal initiative by enjoining us to be ourselves. The depressed individual is unable to measure up. He is tired of having to become himself." End quote. Han builds on this idea, suggesting that depression isn't just about personal failure to be ourselves. He writes, quote, "Depression also follows from impoverished attachment, which is a characteristic of the increasing fragmentation and atomization of life in society." End quote. To this argument, he adds, quote, "It is not the imperative only to belong to oneself, but the pressure to achieve that causes exhaustive depression. Seen in this light, burnout syndrome does not express the exhausted self so much as the exhausted, burnt-out soul." End quote. Han and Ehrenberg argue that modern society's shift from rigid rules to a culture of self-discovery and achievement places immense pressure on individuals. This pressure, combined with the isolation of fragmented, atomized lives, fuels depression and burnout. So first thing, Joel, do you agree with Han and Ehrenberg that the modern expectation to make your own meaning and constantly achieve contributes to depression?
There's a lot to dissect in between what they said and what they've given us to work through, and I both agree and disagree. So dissecting their argument a little bit further, let's discuss that. In some of my critiques of Han previously in our discussion, I do think we overlook historical context for, in this case, depression, because we had ancient Greece also identify depression as melancholia and talk about it as a problem in their society. But when he does talk about the fragmentation and atomized lives that we have that fuels the depression in our modern society, I think that that is hearkening to a truer statement, because society has driven us away from what gives us meaning. I forget the name of the study, but it's one of the longest studies we've had on humans, where the happiness study tracked people for, 70-ish years or something like that. They had multiple directors in charge of it. And they said they had so much data that it's hard to get, true evidence or like concrete facts from that. But that the trends that they saw was happiness comes from people having connections with others. And that's not a big, surprising revelation. And I think we've seen that through books, movies, culture, in history, and nowadays, that oftentimes happiness comes from human connection, be it with family, friends, loved ones. And we see that in longevity for people, that the more social connection, emotional support you have, typically the longer you're able to continue living, because you have more reason to live, you have more connection.
Right. I would agree with that. To the degree that depression is the opposite of happiness in the social axis, and setting aside biochemical and nutritional contributors to it and environmental contributors to it, just looking at the social aspect of depression, I agree with Han and Ehrenberg here that the modern social environment strongly disfavors social connection. On average, of course.
And I would agree that our modern economic society does not provide a space to value or give value for that type of happiness, that type of connection, right? Because you need to move from home to go to a school that has a higher rating so that you can have a better job. And you get that better job that's often in different locations than your living scenario. And then as you move there, we're expected, at least in American society, to be self-sufficient. So you have to buy a car. You have to have a lawnmower, and you can't share a lawnmower with a neighbor. We often are isolating and, as they say, atomizing our life in society.
And even more fundamentally than that, just, taking a step out your front door, wherever that might be in the average American setting, you don't have a relationship with the butcher down the road. You don't have a relationship with the guy who sells fish. You don't have a relationship with the tailor. Everything you need can be bought at a gigantic, soulless building where all goods and services you want are under one roof and performed by a faceless organization with an obscure and hidden supply chain of where things come from.
Because it's more efficient.
It's more efficient. There's nothing inherently set up to have intimacy with the people providing you the goods and services needed for daily life. Whereas in other parts of the world and in other times, where you're getting your meat processed and where you're getting your food and who you're doing business with were much more closely intertwined with the social relationships you had. You knew everyone in the village. You knew everyone in the tribe. Hunting and gathering were happening at the exact same time as you were participating in the relationships around you. Now you can, thanks to the convenience of the modern world and digitization and the internet and the division of labor, you can sit behind a computer and work all day doing coding or emails or drawing up something on a spreadsheet or database. And it can all be done in isolation, like you're saying, apart from everyone else. But it's still labeled as work and participation in society. You are just participating in isolation along with everyone else. So I completely agree with the characterization of atomization.
The best visual I can think of right now is the movie Idiocracy. And in that movie, the scene is they're going to Costco. And in Costco, it is the humorous, cartoonish extrapolation of what that megacorp would be, where I think it's as large as a city in the movie, and they have every single thing, so much so that they have their own subway system to get throughout the store. And our economic reward system, which is how capitalist apologists typically look at it, is it's a reward system to promote what you want in society, does not, like we were agreeing on, does not provide for that, as compared to the best example I heard of as a counter to this is donut economics, which was a thought experiment and proposition by a British economist, in where society does provide an economic space to incentivize humanity or humanitarian actions and a space to be human. And I don't want to get too deep into that, but maybe we can explore some economic books and discuss donut economics on a further episode, because I do think there's a lot of economists trying to answer that question of how do we return to having humanity plugged into our reward system of capitalism.
I would love to explore that topic. This is also a great opportunity for listeners to let us know, directions you'd like to see the discussion go. So one thing that stood out to me is Han describes burnout as an exhausted, burnt out soul. That's a strong image. For me, I've been bone tired as a recovering workaholic. I remember vividly one day it had been right around the third month in a row of not having a day off, working 70 hours a week, 2 jobs, and going to school full time, where it was 2 a.m. and I was behind on getting out the schedule for the week to the rest of the team. And it was 2 a.m. I'm standing at my computer and I'm just involuntarily have tears rolling down my face out of just sheer exhaustion. And that was probably the most bone-tired from a neuronal standpoint, as Han would put it, that I've been. So that's the image that evokes for me, an exhausted, burnt-out soul.
Graduate student, we were often told that we need to work harder in order to achieve, that it was a badge of honor when you reach the clock award. Clock award for us meant you've been in the research lab every hour on the clock, as in from, midnight all the way again to midnight. We had badges of honor where people would set up sleeping cots in our research labs so that you could show your dedication. And this is an uncommon feat we see in Japanese culture or South Korean culture, even Chinese culture, where they also promote a culture of hard work. So much so that if you aren't voluntarily sleeping in the office in order to achieve enough work, then are you really trying? Clearly not. So those are the thoughts that come to me when I think about the burnt out soul, the exhausted soul. We often are expected to become Renaissance people, Renaissance men or women, in the idea that we're supposed to be excelling at every single aspect. We're supposed to be mathematicians and astronomers and great husbands or wives or whatever, and this and that. We can also see that, like we were talking about earlier, in social media life, where if we take the average soccer mom, somehow she's supposed to be well put together at all times, the best mother in the world, the best wife in the world, also run her own business, because how can you be a modern woman without running your own business? And all of these other things that layer on to exhausting this person to achieve the best possible image of themselves.
And Han's point there to me is that the insidiousness of it is that no one is standing behind that person and saying, do this, do that, keep working, work harder. It's internally driven. As Baudrillard said, it's the violence of consensus. It's that social pressure that we've inundated ourselves in. It's like a tragedy of the commons situation where no one person is saying, do all this, and no one person has created the situation. It's just kind of something we've muddled together as a group from generation to generation, but we're also perpetuating it.
Right. In a humorous way, I forget the female comedian that said this joke, but she's talking about how women only wear makeup because other women wear it. And if we all stop wearing makeup, then we never have to do it again, ladies. But the problem is, because every other woman is wearing it, now you have to wear it. And it becomes this self-perpetuating cycle where no one tells you have to do it other than everyone else in your peer group.
Fair point. Same thing with if you're working a white-collar job, dressing up, putting on a button down.
And here I think Hans does do a really good job. And I could be completely wrong, but I separate out to try to not misconstrue his idea of depression as to a clinical or classical idea of depression. Because we had depression before the Industrial Revolution, very common, and sometimes even more so for misunderstood neurological symptoms of an individual. ADHD, borderline personality disorder, in fact, hysteria, and all these things that we used to call people just as a catch-all.
There's many different things that can point to and lead to depression that aren't the social or psychological aspect. There's nutritional deficiencies, there's systemic inflammation, there's thyroid deficiency. There's so many different things that can create depressive symptoms. So definitely not to take away from very real biochemical, neurological, and environmental situations that can cause depressive symptoms. Han is explicitly only looking at the social aspects of depression and the interpersonal aspects of depression.
So in that regard, I know it's a translated piece of work, but I wouldn't use the word depression the way Hans does. But I think he means, if I were to try to do the best for a charitable understanding of it, is, like you said, a much more sociologically driven. And I like his phrase, the exhausted, burnt out soul. And I think that's a way better way to look at it than using the word depression. And in that case, I agree with him.
I don't know that there is a more apt word. I mean, you could kind of point to what he's talking about with the word loneliness. You can kind of point to what he's talking about with meaninglessness. But none of them quite get to exactly what he's talking about. It's very difficult for me to think of something that gets at the concept of what he's talking about besides depression or depressive symptoms. Because I had the same thought. Is there a term that kind of better fits this? And it just doesn't jump out to me. And all those other concepts have to be strung together and put in particular context. But at the same time, the word depression also needs to be contextualized if you and me are going to have a discussion about what Han means. So either way, it's hard, I think.
And I'm not blaming Hans for his use here, only because this harkens to study or field-specific terminology where sometimes we have overlapping terms, but they don't mean the same thing. And you just have to define the definition of that word in that context. And in this case, Hans doesn't do that in his writings, but we can disseminate what he truly means here.
Right. So the only other thought I want to discuss on this is what can we do, or what are things that people are doing that resist this social isolation, this depressive state that comes from the atomization and fragmentization that happens. You mentioned donut economics. I really like the idea of exploring that further. For me, the thoughts that come to mind when I think about this are very similar of it would be great if I could go down the road to someone who lives in my neighborhood or my city and get the goods and services I need from them and have a relationship with them, while being able to do all that. The other thing this makes me think about is often the people we're around the most is the people we work with. Therefore, it seems to me insane to not have a type of personal relationship or friendship with the people you work with to the degree that it makes sense with the business or hierarchy that you're participating in. It just, why not have a more personal relationship with someone you're spending 50 hours working alongside, sweating and burning calories, putting effort into the job you're doing? Why, especially in a office setting, do we have to participate in these silly rules of acting professional when that comes at the expense of warmth and true connection? Why do we have to force ourselves to these superficial connections? And this is something that I've dealt with in my previous careers because I've worked in jobs where I've either worked very long hours or it's a grinding situation for one reason or the other. And to me, it just struck me as crazy as why do we have this artificial barrier? There's two humans working on the same mission here. Why do we have these unnecessary artificial barriers? You know what I mean?
I know what you mean. I think that's a really difficult question. I saw some of that when I was an instructor, where the way that I was taught, even just 5-8 years ago, was very different than the way that I was expected to teach because of what I would say is the surveillance society that we've kind of developed, where now everything is quote unquote out in the open. We have to be super careful to avoid litigious events or disagreements and all of this. So whereas before we could have a more connectivity or teaching assistants and things like that, it wasn't taboo for us to be around students or undergraduates, at the bars or anything like that. I'm 25 and you're 21 and we're both at the bar. But now, or when I was an instructor, we were told that was completely wrong. You can't do any of that. If you're caught talking to any student that's related to your subject, like it could be a big thing and it was a big issue. But that wasn't so much the case 10 years ago. And there's positive and negatives to get from that.
Absolutely.
Right? Because now we don't have to worry about someone abusing their position of power as an instructor that has control over your grades. But in the same way, we're putting more barriers to just humans being humans, to us talking with each other. Because now the responsibilities that we as the instructors were expected to leave the bar, not talk to those people in any capacity, to isolate each other. So now we can't communicate. We have to separate. You can't have this relation, even though we're only, in some cases, 3 years apart.
And I've experienced that exact same issue when I was in my early 20s. I was promoted to, leadership roles where I was leading teams of other people. They're my exact same age who, there'd be 20 of us, and after work, 19 of them would, in some form or another, be hanging out together. And just because I was the manager or the leader or whatever, there was an enforced, both internal and external, there was an enforced degree of isolation and separation. And I get it. On the one hand, there is an imbalance of power and control between the leader and the rest of the group that needs to be taken into consideration and be conscientious of. But at the same time, I'm still a human. I still, again, if I'm spending 50 hours with these people and I'm the only one who, can't fully participate socially, it's harder. It's a harder situation. And at the same time, there's a higher degree of responsibility for someone who has a higher degree of power. What's the Spider-Man quote with great power comes great responsibility?
Right. And so there's positive and negatives, but to add to, the exhausted, burnt out soul and the depression and kind of how we've gotten here is I think we've given up part of our human connectivity capabilities for efficiency, like mega corporations. And we've also given up that due to our litigious and overly surveyed society.
And I think the positive note to kind of wind up the discussion here, I think we're coming to a natural end of this discussion, is that the things that can help us overcome these barriers is focusing on connection and community making. In my life, that's been what's made the biggest difference for me, is starting a book club or spending time with my friends on the weekend, playing D&D or whatever it is. Those moments of meaning, community are really what help remind us to make those connections and have those intimate moments, because we are human. So this will end up being a 2-part or 3-part episode. We've had so much to discuss on this small little book.
All right. And with that, we will bring today's episode to a close for time's sake, even though there's so much more to go through this book, and I'm ready to dive deeper into that as we hopefully close it out next episode. But for today, thank you for tuning in. Thanks for joining. Anything you want to say on closing up our thoughts or ideas on Han's work?
I think we've ended the conversation on a natural stopping point. Like you, I was thinking that today's discussion would only be a single episode, but now I'm realizing that there's so much to talk about. When I'm happy about this, because this is such a fun book, and I really like the ideas that are presented in it, that this is going to be a multi-part. So I look forward to discussing this next time with you. I hope the listeners have enjoyed the discussion. We would love to hear from you. Shoot us a comment, shoot us an email, deepdivebookclub@gmail.com, Deep Dive Book Club on Patreon, Instagram, YouTube, we're Deep Dive Book Pod. We're out there. You can find us. We will talk to you guys next episode.
Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next episode.
Thanks, guys. Bye.